Have you ever grown a purple tomato? I'm sure a lot of you are sitting there saying, "Yeah, I've grown those. They've been available for a long time." But I bet very few of you have grown the real purple tomato. And that's what today's talk is all about. We're going to talk about a new tomato. The cultivar name is actually purple. It's not the description necessarily, it's actually named purple. And it's completely new on the market. This is the first GMO available vegetable seed that gardeners can actually buy. It was available last year in the US. This is a brand new topic, and I think it's one that all gardeners are going to be very interested in. So I have with me today Nathan Pumplin, who's the CEO from Norfolk Healthy Produce. And he's going to provide all kinds of information about this new tomato. So say hello.
Hi, Robert. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
No problem. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and your role with Norfolk?
Yep, absolutely. So, my background is as a plant scientist. I did a PhD in plant genetics from Cornell. I got there because I became fascinated by the evolution of life and especially the coevolution of plants and the pathogens that attack them and cause disease, and also the microbes that form symbioses with plants. So my PhD was on mycorrhizal symbiosis. Probably many of your listeners know about mycorrhiza. There's these beneficial fungi that live in the soil and help plants take up nutrients. And I became very interested in understanding how these work at a DNA level, at a protein level, because this is the kind of thing that can be really helpful in improving the efficiency of how we feed ourselves. And it's also in graduate school that I became a gardener. So I was in my early 20s, and with some other friends from plant sciences, we got a community garden plot in Ithaca, New York, that was right next to the farmer's market. And I used to tell my friends back home, "Hey, I'm a gardener." And they said, "Wait, how old are you?" I said, "No, it's a heck of a lot of fun." And so um, when I got started with Norfolk Healthy Produce about 3 years ago, it was kind of a project that chose me. And it was the combination of gardening, of a new kind of tomato that was really fascinating, beautiful, and had real benefits, has real benefits in the form of new nutrients. The whole thing was powered by biotechnology, which is something that I was very familiar with from my work in R&D. Here we are now able to sell seeds in the US, and we have folks like you who are interested to learn more.
Yeah, that's great. So, are we going to develop plants using GMO technology to make those mycorrhizal fungi more effective?
Well, that was one of the ideas that I had when I got started. The answer is mycorrhiza are very good at doing their job. And I don't think we need GMO plants to improve or to change the way that that
Mm.
symbiosis works. I think the way nature has shaped it is good enough from everything I've learned. But you
Ah,
never know what the future holds.
yeah, that's interesting. So, what I'd like to do in today's program is we're going to look at the history of the purple tomato. I really wish there was a different name for it because it sounds like I'm describing the color, right? Because it is really purple, but it is actually called purple. We'll look at what some of the benefits are, why you should eat this. Well, how does it help us? We're going to look at how to grow it. Is it any different than other tomatoes? We're going to discuss very briefly the problem some people perceive with this because it is a GMO product. And in fact, it's the first GMO seed that's available to gardeners. So that's going to be really interesting to watch how that develops. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then at the end, we'll also look at what the experiences of some gardeners are because it was for sale last year. I believe 13,000 packs of seeds were sold. So we should be able to get some good feedback from gardeners to tell us, do they work? Do we want to grow these things? All right, why don't we start with a brief history of this? I mean, it sort of came on the scene, 2 years ago, people were talking about it. 1 year ago, seed was available and people really started talking about it. But I know the development of this must have started, like 10 years ago.
Even longer. So I'll jump right in, Robert. The tomato was developed by a professor in the UK, Kathy Martin. And actually, it's fun because Kathy is here in Davis, California, visiting us this week. So she was here on site yesterday. Kathy has her entire career, distinguished career, has worked on the production of different nutrients in plants, trying to understand, why are some flowers white and other flowers are purple? And what is the genetics that leads to different nutrients? This led her to discover some what we call master regulators, for the biologists among you, transcription factors. These are the genes that work like on switches. I often think of it as a light bulb. Tomatoes have a purple light bulb that's usually not switched on.
Mm.
Kathy made a discovery in the early 2000s of the on switch that came from snapdragons. And these are, of course, the beautiful flowers. I loved them as a kid, right? You can squeeze them and they have like a mouth that opens. She found these on switches from snapdragons, and she said, I wonder what would happen if you put the snapdragon on switch into a tomato. Could you actually make a tomato purple? And lo and behold, when she did this the first time, she ended up with highly purple tomatoes. And she did this in the mid 2000s, about 2005, 2006. Her first peer reviewed scientific paper came out in 2008.
Mm.
So there's a long history of development. In that study, she actually went all the way to doing a feeding study with cancer prone mice and showed that the purple tomatoes would prolong the life of these cancer prone mice by 30%. And that effect wasn't seen with red tomatoes. Between 2008 and last year, when we started selling seeds, she was hard at work gathering all of the data that was needed for regulatory work. Because, as you mentioned, this is what people call a GMO. There's a ton of regulatory work that we needed to do to release the variety compared with a traditionally bred variety where you could just get it out onto the market and start selling it. And so the other thing that we were doing in the intervening time was breeding the variety. So I'm guessing we'll get deeper into that. But of course, the first varieties that Kathy made in her lab, those are nothing that anyone could grow in the garden. They're not suitable, they're not productive, they didn't taste very good. Even though we have biotechnology, we still have to do the work of traditional plant breeding, combine diverse germplasm, do a lot of grow outs and selections and a lot of generations to get something that's even worthwhile growing in the garden and talking about.
Yeah, it is a much longer process than I think the general public realizes, and that also is one of the reasons why the seeds are a little more expensive than traditional tomato seeds, right? Because a huge amount of money has gone into this project up to this point. I have an interesting question, I think. So I understand the basics of the genetics and the fact that what you're doing is moving a gene in that actually turns on the genes that make anthocyanin, right? So the tomato plant itself makes the anthocyanin on its own, but it makes it in very low amounts. And I think that's important to understand, because that means that what we're doing is not actually changing the chemicals the plant makes. We're just making it easier for the plant to make more, right? It's not like we
That's
put in this weird gene that the plants have never had. Tomatoes make anthocyanin anyways. They just happen to make it in low amounts, right? And
that's exactly right. So
turned on the gene, so now it makes huge amounts.
yep. So a lot of your listeners are probably familiar with Cherokee Purple, which is one of the best heirloom tomatoes, and this has purple shoulders. Those are anthocyanins. For those of you out there who have grown Indigo Rose, Midnight Roma, some of these other tomatoes that have purple skins, these are the same kind of anthocyanins that we have in our tomato. Those, many of you are also probably familiar when you have tomato seedlings, often the stems will be a little bit purple. Under different nutrient stress or light stress, you can see the leaves turn purple. Those are also anthocyanins. Those are all the same nutrients. And these are the same pigments that are in blueberries, that are in eggplant skins, that are in blackberries. They have a lot of nutritional benefits. And so, we haven't introduced something completely foreign. As you say, what we've done is found a way to have the anthocyanins be produced in the tomato during ripening, during their natural development.
Okay, so here's the tricky question. When I put these genes in, am I doing the actual addition of the genes in a test tube? So I end up with these long strands of DNA with the new gene attached. And then how do I get that to form a plant? Like how do I physically end up with a whole plant that has the DNA in there?
I want to start with a question, Robert. Do you know how many genes a tomato has?
30,000.
Yeah, excellent. So you know your genetics. So, plants have about 35,000 genes already. And I think that's an important thing for people to know. as a first level. When we add 2 genes from Snapdragon in, this is a drop in the pool. And of course, I think most of your listeners are like me. We celebrate biological diversity and genetic diversity. There's these beautiful pictures just of tomatoes of all of the sizes and shapes and colors that you get. And of course, there's all sorts of different ways that tomatoes can grow. And so those 35,000 genes, there's tons of differences between different varieties. And so I think one of the important things first to understand is when you insert some DNA from a snapdragon, this is really a small change in the big ocean that is the genetic diversity. Your question is, how do you actually make this happen? The main trick that we use is a bacteria that evolved in nature. It's called Agrobacterium tumefaciens. And this is something that scientists discovered mostly in the 1980s. Sometimes if you're walking in a forest, you go past like an oak tree that has it looks like a tumor, a big gall growing out of the side. And this is usually caused by Agrobacterium tumefaciens. This is a pathogen that evolved to put its own DNA into plant cells, and it reprograms those plant cells to make its own food. So it makes a special kind of sugar, a special kind of amino acid, and it also tricks the plant cells into dividing in such a way that they make this gall that the bacteria can live in. So scientists looked at that and said, boy, that's really interesting. How does that work? They learned that it was inserting the DNA, and then they said, well, what if we took out the bits of DNA that reprogram the plant cells to make tumors and put in different kinds of things? What would happen then? And sure enough, if you reprogram the agrobacterium, it doesn't form tumors. It will insert whatever DNA that you program it to do. And by the way, the technology that's used to mix and match DNA, this is the way that we're able to produce insulin in a cost-effective manner. This is the kind of biotechnology that we rely on in so many basic aspects of our society right now. Yeah. So the first thing you need is an agrobacterium that has your DNA of interest. So in the case of the purple tomato, that's really a small stretch of DNA from Snapdragon that has these transcription factors. The next thing you need to do is get that agrobacterium into a tomato. And the way you do this usually is you take a tomato plant, you chop it up into little pieces, and you put it into tissue culture.
Okay.
So a lot of gardeners are probably familiar with tissue culture because it's used for propagating plants. You can do clonal propagation. The simple thing is sometimes you want to take a cutting of a plant, you dip it in rutone in oxen, and then you put it in water or soil, and you can actually propagate cuttings that way. It's a very similar process. You take the tomato, you put it in tissue culture, you add the agrobacterium, and then usually you have a selectable marker. And that's what we used also for our tomato. This makes the plants resistant to a very specific, very commonly used and benign antibiotic. This is kanamycin. And using that, you can then select for the plant cells that have taken up your new DNA. There's really beautiful examples in YouTube. If you want to see some sort of cartoons to illustrate this, I encourage people to check it out. This is not something that you simply do once and it's done. Just like gardening, you need to sort of grow a garden of different tomatoes. A lot of them are going to die. A lot of them are not going to work correctly. And you need to select for the ones that are strong, that are healthy, and that are, we call it expressing the DNA. And that means, the transcription factors from Snapdragon, they need to be turned on. You told me at the outset you have quite a sophisticated and technical listener group, so I'll get pretty nerdy on here. But this is an important thing. The Snapdragon genes that we have in the tomato, these have to be turned on by something else. So the way that plants grow, just like our bodies, it's these cascades of cause and effect, genes turning genes on, which turn genes on, which turn genes on. And the way the Snapdragon genes are turned on is a little bit of DNA from the tomato. It's what we call a promoter. And this is a piece of DNA that tells genes to be active when fruits ripen. And so that's a long way of saying after we make these GMO plants, the transgenic plants, the Snapdragon genes are quiet, they're turned off until the fruit starts to ripen. When the fruit starts to ripen, then there's a signal that says, okay, activate these ripening genes. Also, activate the Snapdragon genes, which then activate the anthocyanins.
So, in my research of this, I found out there's a Canadian connection. Some of the viewers will know I'm from Ontario, Canada. But I guess some of the early tomatoes were actually grown at a company called New Energy Farms in Ontario. And then they produced seed and shipped it back to the UK. And so there is
Yeah.
an Ontario Canadian connection here to the whole thing.
So
It's kind of interesting. Yeah.
it's very interesting. Let me give a bit of that backstory. So, what Kathy's dream had always been is we have a beautiful piece of science. It's a shame that this just sits at a university locked inside the ivory tower, and gardeners can't grow it, and people can't eat it and get the benefits and the beauty and the fun and the joy that comes with it. And so she was on a search for what's a way that we could actually make this so people could have it. And at the time, in the early 2010s, there was no way that we could have enough money to go through the USDA regulatory process such that we could grow it like a tomato. And so you mentioned before, we spent a lot of money to get to this point. Actually, we've spent very, very little money. We are a tiny company. We don't have much money. It has been mostly government grants that Kathy has gotten to get us to this point. We have a tiny little bit of funding we have from some angel investors who thought, boy, it'd be really cool if this got out. But we are not a big seed company and we don't have deep pockets. And so what we've always done is look for champions and people who say, wow, it'd be good if this could come out in the world. So Kathy found New Energy Farms in Ontario, and they were quite forward thinking, quite innovative. They were working on biofuels, they were working on different projects that held promise for sustainability. New Energy Farms and Kathy came together and said, okay, we won't be able to grow this tomato out in the open because we don't have the money and the resources to go through the regulatory process. When you make a new GMO, it needs to be grown in containment. It can't be out in your garden. It needs to be in a controlled facility until you understand enough that it doesn't pose any risks. And that's what the regulatory process is there. It's there to protect everyone's garden, to protect biodiversity. The idea was we could grow the tomatoes in a greenhouse. We can't sell tomatoes, we can't eat them, the seeds can't get out. What we could do is actually take these tomatoes, process them into a juice, and we could start to get purple tomato juice out to people. And that was the project that we started in Ontario. And unfortunately, that wasn't able to get far enough to actually get a product and get out to market. So Kathy had to go back to the drawing board, and it wasn't until 2022 that we were actually able to go through the USDA process such that we can now treat these tomatoes like any other tomato in the US.
So there are other purple tomatoes around. So I came across the Indigo Rose, which is a new purple tomato out of Oregon State, and it's an organic, non-GMO tomato. If I'm a gardener and I have these two tomatoes in front of me, so I have one of the traditional purples and I have one of your purples, how do I tell the difference? How can I tell that it's not the GMO tomato?
So it's a great question. If you gave me a tomato and said, I want you to guess what variety this is, the first thing I would do would be cut it in half and look at the inside. And the indigo rose, for instance, is red on the inside, whereas our tomato is purple on the inside. Our tomato is the only tomato that's purple all the way through its flesh, and that's the easy indication.
Yeah, and I think that's a really key point. That purple coloration also indicates where the anthocyanin is and how much you have, right? So the other purple tomatoes only have it on the skin, whereas yours is throughout the whole tomato. And that's
Mhm.
the huge difference. And because you have it throughout the whole tomato, the tomato is able to produce more anthocyanin because there's just no more material there, if for no other reason. Whereas if you only have it on the skin, you're only going to produce a very small amount, right? So
That's
that's
exactly
a good
right.
point.
And the way that works, the indigo rose and other purple skin tomatoes, these were developed by crossing to wild relatives of tomato, and they're activated by light. So the more light you have, the more purple you have. Of course, the inside of the tomato doesn't see any light, so it doesn't get activated. The other thing I want to say, as my personal recommendation and belief is gardeners should grow the indigo rose. They should grow the midnight Roma. You should grow Cherokee purple. Of course, we love to have a diversity of different tomatoes. What's really fun about gardening is you see what works well in your soil, in your conditions, what you like the taste of. And it's one of the things I love. There's tons of debate, and there should be, about, hey, I really like sun golds. Oh, I don't like sun golds. They're too sweet, and that's one of the fun. So we're a big
Yeah.
believer that diversity is great, and we belong alongside indigo rose and a bunch of other organic varieties.
One of the potential big problems with this tomato is that it's a GMO. And it's no surprise that historically the general public has been very negative about GMO foods. I don't know what the numbers are, but I'm going to guess that most of them think they're terrible for us and we shouldn't use them. Now, I've written about GMOs for quite a while now. I don't want to go into the myths about GMOs in this program. I've written about them in an article called GMO Myths Understand the Truth About GMO Plants. And I'll put a link to that in the description. I also have a video and I'll put a link to that. But the basic bottom line is that most of the beliefs about GMOs really aren't very valid, and we really don't have to worry about them. In the last couple of days, I found a study by Goodman, which was released in January 2024, so it's fairly recent. And I think his title is perfect. So what he did was he looked at all the science for GMOs and asked the question, is there a risk that eating these products are going to harm us? And his title is 28 Years of GM Food and Feed Without Harm. Why not accept them? And I think that title represents really nicely what we know today from a scientific point of view. There aren't really any studies that show that these are harmful. I'm not talking about purple in general. I'm talking about just GMO food in general. There's no evidence that they're harmful. We've been studying them for almost 30 years. We still can't find an evidence that there's a problem. And it is time we start accepting it. Most scientists who understand the process and understand DNA and genes and so on are board. They don't see a problem with this. I think if the listeners are still concerned, come and look at my article. But I think this is one of these things that we have to get over and accept the fact that GMOs are not going to be a problem for us. Now, I understand that you did a survey as you were bringing these tomatoes to market and ask people what is their attitude towards GMO. And I'd be interested to understand what that survey told you.
I wanna take two steps to get to that survey.
Okay.
So you said, you're not sure what the broader public's opinion is on GMO, but you assume that it's very negative. And this has been one of the surprises that I've learned over the last 3 years, having a very open and honest conversation with thousands of people about a GMO tomato, having had 7 years up to this developing GMOs in the lab, and thinking also everybody hates GMOs because that's what you read about, right?
Right.
What is known, actually, there's a bunch of Pew studies, the Pew Research Trust, that have asked people, what's your opinion about GMOs? And actually, it's about 50-50 of people who think that they're bad for you or that they're neutral or beneficial. So already that's a surprise. If you poll scientists, it's 85% of scientists say they're perfectly fine. And you're absolutely right. There's no data at all that say GMOs are bad for you. So I do want to come back to what are some of the concerns that people have and where does that come from? Because there are legitimate reasons separate from the science and technology to be concerned about how they're used when it comes to ownership and control and the food supply and input outputs and the meaning for farmers, right? Your question is, what did we see in our own research? We asked 400 people throughout the US. We presented them the tomato and we said, this is a GMO. It has these anthocyanin nutrients. This is how we produce it. Are you interested in trying this? And 80% of them said, yes, very interested to try this tomato. There was only about 5% of people who said, nope, I never want to try it. It's a GMO. I'm not interested. That's a huge surprise.
That's huge. Yeah.
you know, the vast majority of people say, I'm not really even clear what that is. Why should I be worried about it? This seems really good. And yet everyone thinks that everyone else thinks GMOs are bad.
Mm.
And so there's this sort of weird second and third order concern about it. I've had, talked to hundreds and hundreds of people. One of the things we do, Robert, so I'm in Davis, California. We run a farmer's market booth at the
Okay.
Davis Farmers Market. We sell tomatoes, we sell seedlings, and we get to talk to all sorts of people. And we have people come and say, hey, this is a GMO. isn't this bad for me? And we're able to have a really open conversation, which I love. And usually people come away and they say, hey, I thought I was against GMOs. I guess I'm just against, Monsanto, or I'm not comfortable with Roundup, something like that. But, GMOs as a blanket technology, I'm no longer against. And I think, they've really been established as other, this is frankenfood, this is something to be afraid of. And most people don't know a lot of information, and they just say, hey, it sounds too risky, we shouldn't mess with it. And one of the things I think is really interesting is, remember, tomatoes came from the Americas. They're a new world food. When they were first introduced into Europe for about 100 years,
Mhm.
people wouldn't eat them,
Yeah.
right? And they said, hey, it's the deadly nightshade family. These are poisonous. There's all sorts of beliefs of why they're bad to eat. And still to this day, that persists, of some people
Mhm.
thinking, oh, these are inflammatory, they have these compounds that are bad. Lots of people, or there's some people who say, I don't want to eat tomatoes, I think they're bad. But the vast majority of us love them. So I'm a huge tomato fan. I want to also speak to some of the concerns I hear people raise about, well, what if it's out of control and it spreads? What if, the purple tomatoes pollinate another tomato that I have in my garden, and then, oh my gosh, it's out of control. When you understand gardening and you understand how evolution works, this is not something that becomes a super weed. If you save your seeds, for instance, you might have your Cherokee purple growing next to your sun golds. You'll save your Cherokee purple seed, plant it back the next year, and you get Cherokee purple, right? Tomatoes are really good at selfing, and we don't worry too much about cross contamination with different types of tomatoes. And again, our tomato is really just a tomato. It's no different in those rules. And then the other thing is, the purple tomato isn't something that has a fitness advantage over other types of tomatoes. So this doesn't become the next kudzu, right? Invasive species are a concern that has nothing to do with GMOs, that has to do with other types of biodiversity.
Yeah, that's one of the things I found is that when people hear GMO, their concerns usually are things that revolve around these things, like invasives and Monsanto and Roundup. People hate Roundup, so they hate Monsanto and they hate anything GMO. And I explain to people that those are completely different topics. So let's talk about your licensing a little bit. So right now, these seeds are only available in the US, and you can't sell them in other countries because of various regulatory requirements and approvals and so on. What are your plans for making them available in other countries?
Let's talk first availability. Right now, you're right, they're only available in the US, where we've completed the regulatory process.
Yeah.
We are working on the regulatory process right now in Canada and also Australia. We hear from people all the time of, hey, why can't I grow these in Germany? Why can't I grow these in the country where I live? And the answer is, there's a whole bunch of regulations that govern GMO crops, and all of these flow from the fears that people have about, what happens if these things get out. For those countries where there is a path for us to go through the regulatory process, we're working on that. We're not a huge seed company. This does not make a lot of money, and we can't spend a lot of money getting that out. So really, we're listening to the people who want it, and where we're able to, we're trying to get seed legally out to them.
Do you have a deadline for Canada and Australia?
We're hoping in 2026 that they are. One of the tricky things about the regulatory process is there aren't many products like ours. So
Mhm.
there isn't a really clear step by step, okay, this is what it happens and this is how long it takes. So we have some ideas of when we think it's going to be, but it's a conversation with the regulators.
So one of the big advantages of this tomato is that it's healthier for us, right? It has these anthocyanins in it. The anthocyanins, they neutralize antioxidants. Antioxidants cause problems in our body. So in theory, at least, they help us get rid of some of these diseases or prevent these diseases or slow them down or have some effect on these diseases. So that's the health benefit of those. How much evidence is there that eating a reasonable number of these tomatoes every day or every couple of days is actually going to make a difference in our health? Do we have any concrete science that actually supports that?
So we have a lot of concrete science on the health benefits of anthocyanins. When you get to health and nutrition, it gets it gets very tricky, right? So I don't want to oversimplify. Let me start by saying these are not a silver bullet. I'm not saying, boy, your life is terrible and eat a few purple tomatoes and it's going to be night and day and cure all of your ails, right? What we know is eating fresh fruits and vegetables is extremely healthy. And one of the things that Kathy Martin, our founder, always says is pharmaceuticals are not healthcare, they're sick care. Healthy food is healthcare, right? And the best way to take care of our bodies and lead a healthy life is to eat fresh fruits and vegetables. And within that, the best thing to do is eat the rainbow, right? Eat
Right.
fresh fruits and vegetables of all the different colors because anthocyanins, as you say, these are an antioxidant. These are very healthy for us. Lycopene, which is what makes tomatoes red, is also really good for us. Beta carotene, which makes carrots orange, is really good for us. You know, all sorts of things in green foods are good for us. And so what's important is that we're eating a balanced diet of a bunch of fresh fruits and vegetables.
Right.
What we know is the purple part of the rainbow, there are not a lot of foods that a lot of us eat that have anthocyanins. So again, if you're eating a cup of blueberries a day, awesome, you're all set. Most people eat about 12 milligrams per day of anthocyanins, and you need to eat about 10 times that to get benefits. So your question was, you know, how concrete is the science?
Mhm.
There are a lot of studies, and especially recently, over the last 10 years, over the last 5 years, that show the benefits of anthocyanins in anti-inflammatory effects, anti-cancer effects, there's benefits to heart health, to lung health, to brain health, to mental well-being. This is seen partly at the molecular level. You can draw people's blood and you can test markers for health. And it's also seen in cell culture studies. This is a growing body of science that shows the benefits that come from eating anthocyanins. It's a really fascinating area. The mechanisms are not always clear. There's a growing amount of data, and Kathy has been involved in some of these studies as well, that the purple compounds have an impact on our microbiome. So that's, you know, the bacteria that live in our guts, in our intestine, and help metabolize food. Those have a big impact on our health and well-being. You've probably heard of probiotics and prebiotics, and these are the types of foods that impact our microbiome and lead to beneficial health outcomes. And so, you know, all that to say, we should be eating more purple foods, and however you get them is great. One thing we know is that people in the US eat about 20 times more tomatoes than they do blueberries by volume. I'm not saying stop eating red and yellow tomatoes. We think it's really a great approach for a lot of people to, you know, have a salad with some red tomatoes, some yellow tomatoes, and purple tomatoes, and you get a lot of the rainbow right there, a little basil and some spinach underneath, and you got a salad of health.
Some people don't really buy into this. They're not saying that they aren't healthy, but the science isn't good enough yet. So I actually went out and looked at what the human studies are showing us. So I've come up with three things. So three things that anthocyanins do is lower blood pressure. And the science on that seems to be fairly mixed. There's a lot of positive studies, there's some negative studies. I couldn't find anything that was really strong on that. Now, I have to admit that there's a lot of lab work that is positive, but the clinical studies there's less of those. The other one is to reduce heart attacks. And turns out that in 2023, there was a meta study that looked at all of the studies and they actually found positive effects on heart attacks. So I think that's valid. I think that was a pretty good study. The other thing they're claimed to do is reduce cancer. And there was a Cleveland Clinic review in 2022, which is also fairly recent. And they concluded maybe, which is common with a lot of these clinical studies. The problem they had was not that there wasn't some evidence, but that there isn't enough clinical studies. So most of the evidence is lab studies, and there's very little clinical studies one way or the other. So overall, I guess we still have a long ways to go with this science. And I think it's important that readers understand that when they see headlines, particularly medical headlines, nutrition headlines, all these sort of things, most of the time we don't actually know as much as we put in the headlines, right? So we have to be a little cautious. But overall, the suggestion is that anthocyanins are certainly healthy for us. So we should try to eat more. So that comes down to a really important question. How much high anthocyanin do you actually have in one of those tomatoes? And I couldn't find that number anywhere.
Yeah, so it's about 200 milligram serving of purple tomatoes. It's similar levels by volume to what is in blueberries. And what your gardeners probably know is different growing environments, you can have slightly different results. Larger, smaller fruit, sometimes it's sweeter, sometimes it's less sweet. And so the genetics of a variety is one of the impacts, and also the growing conditions that you have can have a big impact on that.
Now, the other thing I found is I looked at the other purple tomatoes. So this is not your purple. These are the imitation purples, and their anthocyanin levels are about 1/15 of the blueberries. So they're significantly less than the blueberries are. And I think that comes back to the fact that in your tomato, the whole volume of the tomato is purple and has anthocyanin in it. Even if the amount per gram is the same, and I'm not saying it is, there's just many more grams in your tomato when you eat it than just the skin of the other ones. So if someone's eating these for health reasons, the purple is really the way to go. So let's talk about some feedback from gardeners. So these seeds went on sale for the first time in the US last year. 13,000 packs were sold, I believe. So you must have some feedback from gardeners. What are gardeners telling you about how well did they grow? What did they taste like? Would they grow them again?
This is the best part, I have to say, of getting to put this product out there, is hearing back from gardeners, the good, the bad, and the ugly of what their experience is. So for those of you who ordered, here's the packets that we sent out last year. And you're right, 13,000 packets we shipped out. By and large, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Hey, these tasted so great. They were prolific. They yielded a bunch. They lasted very long into the season, much longer than some of the other tomatoes that I had that succumbed to diseases. And I shared them with my neighbors. They said, what is this? This is so beautiful. This is so cool. So I would say, by and large, overwhelmingly positive. As with anything, not everyone was thrilled. So we had some people follow up and say, hey, I got really poor germination on the seeds. We were able to talk to them and replace the seeds for people that had that experience. We've made some changes in how we're shipping the seeds this year, so they're better protected in the mail. The other thing we heard from people is, well, I don't think these are the best tasting tomatoes. They're not as sweet as some of the other ones that we grow. And, it's beautiful. It's kind of cool. It's not the best tomato. It's not for me. One important thing is we're not for everyone. I'm not here to try to please everyone. I'm thrilled when there's, a small fraction of people who say, hey, we love this. We want to keep growing it. And also, we're constantly breeding new varieties. So the main thing that we do as a company is we are crossing our tomato to other tomatoes that have excellent flavor, good growth habits. We're of course developing a bigger tomato. So these are cherry tomatoes we have now. We are working on a bigger tomato that will come out as soon as we're ready. So we're listening. But we love when people discuss, and I'll give one last anecdote. There's a lot of talk on Reddit about the tomato, and there's a number of threads that we're comparing our tomato to Sun Gold. And people say, "Oh, I think Sun Gold's a sweeter tomato, and I prefer that." And I'm flattered that they're even making that comparison, right?
Right. Yeah, being compared to Sun Gold is pretty good. So, anyways, you're the CEO of this company, so we have to take your results with a grain of salt there because you might be a little biased. So, I ran my own
Absolutely.
survey. My survey is not very extensive, but I have a Facebook group called Garden Fundamentals, and so we discussed the tomato there, and we asked people for their opinion. And quite honestly, they mimic what you just said. The majority of people found that they grew well, they were very productive, they loved the flavor. No disease issues that were any different than other tomatoes. We did have a couple of people who did have germination problems, but the majority didn't. And that's true of any seed. There's always some people who, don't do it quite right, especially gardeners, right? We're not
Yep.
professionals.
Yep.
There was one person who said, I really didn't care for the taste, probably won't grow them again because of that. The majority of them like the taste and will grow them again. That was very informal. It was just sort of a post that someone put up, and it may have been me who said, okay, it's been a year. Everyone grew these tomatoes last year. What did you find? Right? There's no data or anything. But as a general response for a new variety, I thought that was quite positive.
I'm honored actually. I was bracing myself for you to say,
We all hated
everyone
them.
hated him. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well,
It is
that's really why I asked the question, because I wanted to know, and these are people, throughout the U.S. So we've quite a broad audience. So these are people in
yeah,
California with warm climates. We have people up in Northeast with cold climates.
yeah.
So it was quite a diverse group, and yeah, the results were quite positive. Hmm.
I have to comment, Robert, and say I'm really grateful. First of all, that people are even willing to give these a try. There's so many interesting tomatoes out there, and everyone's garden, all the space, every plant is at a premium. And so the fact that people are willing to give it a try and they're interested to talk about it is just wildly gratifying. And it's a scary thing to put anything creative out into the world.
Right.
And we're plant breeders, we're scientists, we're also artists, and you put something out in the world and you're going to be judged by it. And, we have a fantastic group of people. We're a tiny little company. We have a fantastic group of people here who are breeding the tomatoes, producing the seeds day in and day out. And, the fact that we hear feedback like that, it just makes it all worthwhile.
Yeah. And you're right. It's especially true for tomatoes, right? Because there's, like, I don't know how many thousands of different varieties of tomatoes, right? It's not like
Yeah.
you're competing with three varieties here. I'm going to do a little promo here. So if we're not talking about how to grow these tomatoes, but if you're new and you don't know how to grow tomatoes, I do have a free ebook, 75 pages. Go on my site and get it. I'll put the link in the description. You get that, that'll show you how to grow tomatoes. What I would like to discuss here is there anything different about growing these tomatoes than growing your average tomatoes that gardeners should be aware of?
No. The main answer is these tomatoes are just like any other tomato. Treat them as you would treat other tomatoes. So a few of the then nuanced details, they're indeterminates. My preference is to maintain the single shoot. So you cut off any suckers. There are people who grow them more in the bush style, and that can work really, really well. And of course, it's a little less work. What some of the gardeners will find is this variety is very vegetative. It wants to put out a lot of suckers. So you may want to let some of them go. But generally, fertilizer wise, light wise, treat them like you would treat any of the other tomatoes that you have. One thing I will say that's important is when do you harvest? So of course, when you harvest a tomato is really important. What you'll find, these form green and then they start to turn purple. And if you harvest them right when they turn purple, they're not quite ripe. So you want to try to be patient. Yeah, your patience is rewarded, and wait until they're a little bit soft to the touch. And when you get your first truss and you start to pick them, those who haven't learned yet will learn very quickly that they do get sweeter. They have twice the shelf life as well, so it turns out the anthocyanins are really good for the tomato longevity. You can leave them on your counter for a week or two, and they'll continue to ripen on the counter and get better and better.
Okay, so we have this great tomato. It's got these Snapdragon genes in there. This is a tomato where you can collect the seed and regrow the seed, and the genes follow the seeds. So the next generation will also be purple. How many generations do you figure this will work for? Like, is this going to go on forever? Or because I think I read where you've done like 6 generations already, and the genes are still stable.
So we are well over 20 generations
Oh,
since Kathy made the original transformation, and these genes ought to be stable just like all the other genes in a tomato. I did almost 6 years of research in what we call epigenetics, which
mhm.
is how genes can get turned off. That's often a problem when you make transgenics early on, and you simply need to select and run enough generations to see what's stable. And so, from everything we've seen, these should be stably expressed just like any other tomato genes.
If I cross one of these with a regular red tomato, I will get purplish tomatoes out of that, right?
Yep.
I've seen some reports where you've done a number of those studies.
Yep. So these genes work as dominant, which means if
Okay.
you cross them, and this is in essence an heirloom, right? This is an OP variety. If you cross this to another OP or heirloom, then you would get what's called an F1 hybrid. So like Sun Gold is an F1 hybrid, for instance, and that will be purple.
I gotta jump on your heirloom there because that was one of the questions I was thinking of asking you. So First of all, for the listeners who think they know what heirlooms are, there is no definition for heirlooms. So we can pretty much come up with any definition we want. So you're right, whatever your definition is. Some people say, well, it has to be around for 30 years. Some people say 50 years and so on. But if we've waited 30 years, essentially we have an heirloom then, right? You've already said that.
Mhm.
Maybe a bit premature at this point, but for gardeners, though, you have 20
Yeah.
generations. Gardeners only have one generation. It is going to be similar to an heirloom in that you can collect the seed and reuse the seed, and you get the same kind of plant next year, right? That was the point you were
Yeah.
trying. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll back off the claim of this being an heirloom. In the breeding lingo, you talk about generations until something is stable. A new wooden chair that you make will be stable and is not yet an heirloom until it's been passed on 2
Right.
generations, right? So I think that's an important
There are
part,
some gardeners
but
who are
it is
very,
genetically stable.
yeah, there are some gardeners who are very fussy about that. So yep, be careful.
Yeah.
Another question is the genes we're interested in, let's call them the purple genes. Do they come from the seed parent or the pollen parent or both?
So they will be in both,
It will be in
right?
both.
So because this is fixed, it's in 2 copies, which means when you have meiosis and you make new pollen, it's in all the pollen, and when you make new eggs, it's in all of the eggs.
Thanks. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Going to quote from your license. It says, no sale of fruit, seeds, or plants are permitted, including any derivative varieties. Now, I think derivative varieties is probably something your lawyer said to say. It seems a little vague, but I assume that if we go back to the sun gold example, if I breed yours with sun gold and I get a new hybrid, that's
Mhm.
what's covered by derivative varieties, right? So any tomato that I cut in half and is totally purple inside is going to be one of your derivatives.
That's exactly right. Yep. That's exactly right. And why do we do that? This is not because we're greedy. It's not because we're bent on control, or we want to sue farmers and you certainly sue gardeners. That is the opposite of what we want to do and how we want to live in the world. The reason for that is one, because the regulatory landscape only lets us be in the US right now, we want to make sure that that message is coming across with the seeds. The other thing is, as you mentioned, there's a lot of time and resources that went into developing this tomato. And for right now, we want to maintain all of the commercial rights that go along with it. So we sell seeds to home gardeners. These are for you to grow and enjoy, to share with your community, with your family and your friends. We encourage everyone to be very generous. If you want to sell the tomatoes, we also encourage you to do that. And we ask that you reach out to us and get a commercial license so then you can do the commercial work. The derived varieties, yes, it's anything, if you cross this to a red tomato, you went through the generations. Um, we understand that people will do this. We don't want to stop it. We're not going to sue people in their gardens. We just ask that you reach out to us and we talk about licensing terms.
Right. Okay, fair. You're actually branching out into another area, which may actually be your main business long term, and that's actually selling the tomatoes. You have a new name for this tomato called the Empress Limited Edition tomato,
Mhm.
which is the purple tomato, I assume, and it's now being marketed in some parts of the US.
So, the to start with the intent, we'd really like people to be able to get more anthocyanins in their diets and enjoy the tomato. So, gardeners, of course, when the season hits in the summertime, you have tomatoes coming out of your ears together with squash and everything else. But the vast majority of people in the US are not gardeners and they get all of their food from grocery stores. And so we really want to meet people where they are. And getting these available in grocery stores is the best way. We partner with a company called Red Sun Farms. They operate excellent greenhouses in Canada and also in the US. And they produced a crop that they sold at several retailers, Lidl, Food Lion, and Food City. And we sold over 100,000 clamshells of tomatoes in 2024. So it's another really excellent example that people are not opposed to this product, quite the opposite. They really love that. And so we're now looking for other ways to get this product out into people's plates and get the benefit and the beauty out there.
I did also notice you mentioned it, but that Red Sun Farms is actually an Ontario company.
Yeah.
So here we go again, being involved with this process. They also have on their website, at least they have greenhouses in Mexico too. Yeah, that sounds very interesting. Okay, so what are the future plans? I found something that Kathy Martin, so she's the original developer of this. She's working on a tomato called Indigo. I
Mhm.
don't know if that's true. And so I don't know how much of this you want to tell us, but we'd be interested to know what's coming down the pipe and what can we expect in the future.
Purple tomato is really our focus right now. And, just because we have a purple tomato, we don't stop there. There's a lot of different types of varieties that we'd like to develop with this trait, right? And so the number one request we've had is for a real
Yeah.
tomato that is a bigger tomato that you can slice and put on a sandwich. That's a big focus of what we're working on right now. I really um, coming from the world of technology and science, it's very easy to say, hey, now let's make 10 other things. And it's really hard to do anything well. And so we are trying to make sure we're not getting ahead of ourselves, really have the patience and put the time in getting great purple tomatoes out. Then we're listening. And that's the most important thing. And the most fun of having this product is we get to listen to people of what they want, right? And one person says, hey, I really want purple ketchup. So this is one of the biggest, controversial opinion pieces. A lot of people say, boy, a purple pepper, a purple bell pepper would be phenomenal. And so that's one of the top ones up there. There's other purple fruits and vegetables that we think would be interesting to start to toy with and get out onto the market. I also want to be clear that, we're not the GMO company. What we're interested in is what are varieties of fruits and vegetables that people don't have readily available now, and they may be interested in them? And these can be varieties that, for whatever reason, are a little weird. I mean, we're a little bit of a weird company, um, and not anything that uses technology, but just something that doesn't fit the mold. And so we are very interested in different types of, especially tomatoes that have nutritional benefits that are distinctive in some kind of ways that can complement the purple tomato. So that's what you'll see from us next.
Oh, that's great. Well, this was a blast. I personally am not against GMOs, and I suggest that anyone who still has some doubts, do your own research and read up on this. I think a lot of the things you read out there are kind of scary sounding. They're not true. That's the problem. Social media has
Yeah.
spread so many lies about GMOs. And based on the results from last year, I think this tomato is going to become very popular. I mean, would have been very easy for my audience and the people who responded to just say, well, I tried them, they weren't very good, I'm not going to grow them again, right? I've got 1,000 other tomatoes I want to grow. And most of these people have favorite tomatoes. So it's not like they're growing a tomato for the first time. They have this thing they've been growing for 20 years and they like, and they grew this new one and compared it to that one. And they're very positive about it. So all I can say is give them a try. They sound really exciting. Bottom line is GMOs are here to stay. They're going to change our food a lot. Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. Good luck with the next tomato.
Robert, thank you so much. It's great to have the conversation. I love your questions. And, I encourage folks that hear this that have questions to reach out to us too. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. And then I've been holding this tomato the whole time, so I have to eat it.
Well, I have a funny story for you. So, one of the questions that was submitted to my Facebook group was get them to eat a tomato online. They wanted to see you actually eat one of these things. And I thought, well, I wasn't going to ask you that. That's what they wanted to see. So maybe you do that in all programs. I don't know, but they wanted you to
I
see it. Are you still alive?
I'm still alive. I'm feeling better than ever. I eat a lot of these. I have to say, I really love these tomatoes. It's sort of it's a corny thing to say, but I really love these. And life is too short to do things that you don't love. And cooking with these, serving these to family and friends is just a daily joy.
I don't have one. Next year, next year they're in Canada, you promised. So
We're we're working we're
we're
working
waiting
on it.
for them.
We're working on it for you, Robert.
All right.
Well, thank
Thanks
you
very
so
much.
much.
See you again. Bye.